appreciate you all showing up today. My name is Matt, and I'll be doing a presentation on potatoes. But I would like to start off, we don't have too many people here, but if y'all don't mind taking a guess, I'd like to start off with a trivia question. Whoever gets the closest will win a Kennebec potato. But if you had to guess, how many potatoes do we worldwide consume every day? You want to give a guess? No? You want to give a guess? So worldwide, how many potatoes each day?
Not pounds.
No, not pounds. Individual, medium-sized potatoes. How many do we consume every day, worldwide?
Like a billion?
What's that?
A billion?
A billion? That's a good guess. That's more than I would have thought, but that's a good guess.
Half a billion.
Half a billion. So I was when I tried to guess, I was guessing close to you, maybe half a billion, a few hundred million. The real answer is 4.7 billion potatoes.
Billion?
Wow.
4.7 billion?
So you win.
Wow, that's a lot of potatoes.
It was a shocking stat to me. That's why I wanted to include it. Because that just seemed mind-boggling that we eat that many potatoes every single day. And if you multiply it out to a year, that comes out to 200 billion potatoes we eat every single year as humans. So why do we do this and how do we do this? Both answers are pretty straightforward. The why we grow this many potatoes is because it is pretty much the best crop per square meter for getting the most amount of food. So if you're just trying to get as much food as possible, pretty much the best thing to plant is potato. That being said, it also it's a crop that is full with carbs, protein, fiber, antioxidants, iron, potassium, and all other kinds of minerals. It has all of that with barely any fat and barely any cholesterol. So if you were just stuck with potatoes and water, you could live for a pretty long while okay. You wouldn't be that healthy, but it would be one of the better crops just to keep you going compared to all the others, basically. Also, since it is something that is so easily grown and so easy to feed people, it's also something that stores very well. So it's not something that you have to grow and eat right away. You can store it, it keeps well, and since you can store it, therefore you can transport it. These characteristics have led it to have a kind of a long history of being used as money in certain parts throughout the world. If you happen to have Netflix, I recommend a documentary called The Trader that was made in 2017. It kind of highlights this aspect of potatoes, how they're used as money. It's just a short documentary that follows a trader around in the Republic of Georgia and just shows how they use potatoes as money. It's very interesting. All right, so that tells us kind of why we grow potatoes. They're just an easy crop and they provide so much and you can do so much with them. Now, how are we able to grow that many potatoes? It's kind of another straightforward answer as well. It's just they're very easy to grow. They can grow in just about any part of the world almost, depending on the type of potato. And there's not too much of a learning curve on how to grow them. It can be as simple as put them in the ground, water them, watch them grow, and dig them out. It's kind of that simple. So the potato is the only staple crop that's found on every single continent in the world. It's found even in Antarctica. It's not obviously grown there, but it's served every day in Antarctica at the research center. That's just kind of a testament to its portability and storage capabilities. Also, in 2015, it was successfully grown in space. So literally, no matter where you go, you kind of can't escape the potato. It's everywhere. All right, so a quick history of the potato, just to kind of give a background of how it got to this point. So kind of where did it all start? It started about 10,000 years ago, high up in the mountains in Peru, where the potato started. The Incas are credited as kind of creating the potato. They did this in the highlands of the Andes Mountains near the Lake of Titicaca. That's the kind of the birthplace of the potato. At this time, like all crops, the potato was wild. It wasn't wasn't something that we farmed yet at this point. And in its wild state, the potato was pretty much inedible. And that's because, like all potatoes, even to this day, they have an alkaloid in it called solanine. And solanine, try to eat that. If the potato has a lot of solanine in it, it's going to make you sick. Won't necessarily kill you, but you're going to have an upset stomach, things like that. So, for many, many years, the Incas would try to eat potatoes and they would get sick. So it just never really worked. And then one day, for whatever reason, the Inca decided to take a potato, cover it in clay, and then eat it. And who knows why he decided to do that? Some people think watching kind of llamas or wildlife in the area eat potatoes covered in clay gave him that idea. But because they did this, the minerals in the clay would bind with that alkaloid, and it made them safe to eat at that point. So I guess he told his buddies to do this, and it caught on and spread, and then now all of a sudden, the Inca people are eating potatoes. And now since they're eating potatoes, they have to grow more potatoes. And through this long process of growing potatoes and somehow knowing about selection and things like that, they were able to reduce the solanine levels in potatoes by 95%. Now, I'm sure this took quite a long time, but the potato that they were left with is the exact same potato that we have today. So that is kind of the journey of how the potato went from being a crop that nobody could use to something that ended up building empires and things like Machu Picchu. That's what happened. All right. So now that we know kind of how the potato started, its origin place, it had many, many years of success under the Incas. The Inca people were thriving, the potato was thriving, everything was going pretty good. Then one day Spain decided to show up. They messed things up pretty bad. Unfortunately, since the Inca didn't really have a tradition of writing things down in terms of what the Spaniard would be able to understand, at this point the potato kind of loses its importance and it loses its kind of use as a food for people. The Spaniards, they understood it as a crop, and they took it back with them, and they would grow it and trade it and use it. But they would use it more as something like for pig feed, or at the very least, if you're a very, very poor peasant or a soldier that had nothing else to eat, then maybe you eat potatoes. But they weren't grown as a food source that we're using now. And that stayed that way for quite a long time. The next kind of example of when potatoes become food again is you have to fast forward all the way to the 1500s at this point, and brought to China by Dutch traders was the potato. And in the kind of mid to late 1500s, during the Ming Dynasty, potato once again was starting to be used as a food source. And it wasn't only a food source for just poor and peasants and things like that. The Ming Dynasty understood it as a food source for anyone from high up to low down. Everybody was eating potatoes, and it hadn't been that way since the Inca Empire until this point. So that was kind of its new resurgence in history. Its kind of new importance. It helped fight off famine. And from that point on, it kind of took a pretty good foothold in history. It was able to eat more easily spread across the world at that point. It's a little bit of a rocky road for potato in places like Europe. After this, it has some religious connotations that kept it from being grown. People thought it might be evil because it was grown closer to hell, things like that, kept the potato from being spread. But for the most part, worldwide, the potato was starting to become more and more accepted. One last little bit in history, it's not really that significant, but it kind of ties into one of our products, so I wanted to point this out. In the late 1800s, the U.S. passed a law allowing any uninhabited island that contained guano. And guano is just a type of organic fertilizer made mainly from bats, sometimes birds. In the late 1800s, we passed a law that allowed any island that was not inhabited that contained guano to be annexed. And this resulted in us annexing somewhere around 100 islands. And that was one of the major kind of stepping stones in the growth of our military. So the potato kind of really helped shape our military force. And the reason I bring up guano is it was such an important fertilizer, not only for potatoes. It was the main fertilizer for potatoes back then, but just about everything else was being fertilized with guano. And the Happy Frog soil that we have right here, it's the only soil that I know of being made that contains guano in it. So if you're going to be growing potatoes in containers, I would say that's probably your best bet just based off of the guano being there. All right, let's do one more trivia question for another Kennebec potato. If you had to guess what the biggest potato ever grown was, what would you guess? In terms of pounds.
15 pounds.
15 pounds, good.
Yeah, 20 pounds.
20?
Yeah. I was going to say 20, so I'll go 22 pounds.
Okay.
10.
Okay.
10?
I was, oh man, I was gonna say, 12.
The answer is 11. 11 pounds. So you get this.
Huge.
There you go.
Alright.
There is a record of a 22, what they thought was a 22-pound potato called Doug, but they did a DNA test on that, and that turned out to be something closer to like a yam or something like that. It wasn't a technical potato. The largest potato, I believe, I don't remember the exact place, but it was Glasgow or somewhere in England. It was 11 pounds in 2011. It's the biggest one on record. So that's kind of our goal. That's what we're shooting for. That's, I guess, the best you can do is 11-pound potatoes. So now let's start actually talking about how to grow potatoes, the reason most of y'all are here. All right, so first off, we need to determine what type of potatoes that we have. Like tomatoes, there's basically two main types. There's an indeterminate type and a determinate type. And if you're familiar with tomatoes, and if you know what that means, it's basically the same thing for potatoes. Let me use this one here. It's going to determine how they grow. So indeterminate potatoes, first of all the potatoes that we offer are determinate. That's kind of what you need to focus on. Just to give you an idea of what indeterminate potatoes are, they're going to be the kind as this thing grows its stem, it'll put out potatoes as long as there's dirt around that stem, no matter how high it goes. Determinate potatoes are different. They're only going to put out potatoes basically in this region right around in here where you plant that potato. So if you were to plant this way down here, and then as it grows, if you were to plant this potato way down here, and then as it grows, put more dirt, and as it grows, put more dirt, you're not going to get potatoes in this region at all. It's kind of, you're just wasting that space. If it was a indeterminate potato, then yes, you would get potatoes in that space. But all of these varieties, and pretty much all varieties we grow in this area, are determinate varieties. So if you were to plant it more so right here, then you're going to have area for potatoes up in here and up in here. It's going to be the range where you're going to get your potatoes. All right, so now that we know what kind of potatoes we're growing, I'm going to just review the 4 types that we have and kind of how long it takes for them to be ready, so that you'll kind of get a good idea of when to be harvesting. The redless soda, that's these right here. This is probably one of our best potatoes for southern gardeners. It's a great potato for soup. This one, it does well with our heat and drought, more so than any of the other potatoes. It's ready in about 80 to 100 days after time of planting. The Yukon, which are these ones right here, those are our only early potato that we offer. They're great just about any way you want to cook those. But those are ready in 60 to 80 days, so quite a bit difference from the 80 to 100 day range. The Kennebec, these guys right here, I believe, those are going to be 80 to 100 days, and then the Purple Majesty, these kinds, purple type potatoes, those are 85 to 100 day time to be ready. You might have heard the term called sprouting a potato. What that means is just getting these little eye holes to actually start sprouting. So how do you go from a potato that doesn't have any little eye holes on it to one that starts to have these? It's very simple. The way I do it is I just put the potatoes in a paper bag, keep them in a dark, cool, kind of dry place for a few days. I check them about every 3 days. Once they're about to this point, if I'm not ready to plant them yet, I'll pull them out of that bag and just put them on like a sunny windowsill or something like that. So the darkness is what's going to trigger these to kind of start swelling up where you can actually see where they are. But once they start to go, you don't want to keep them in the dark. You You don't want them to get leggy. So once they start to go like this, put them in the somewhat sunny area. It'll keep them nice and healthy. You don't want to wait too long. There is a certain amount of time that this can last before you got to plant it. It is quite a while. You could probably go a month, maybe even more. It'll shrivel up real bad, but you can still plant it and it'll still work. But kind of the closer you can get to planting them when they're at this point, the better. Now, in terms of, and then when you are planting them, you're going to want to make sure these eyes are facing up. So you can angle the potato however that may be, but just the eyes facing up is the most important part. And let's say if there's some eyes on this side and eyes on this side, I just pick the side that has the most or healthiest looking eyes, and that's the side I plant on. How big of a piece should you plant? So not all the seed potatoes are the same size. Some are going to be real big, some are going to be very small. The kind of the sweet range and kind of the thing you're going for are pieces that are about 2 to 3 ounces big, or about the size of an egg. So a piece like this right here is about the perfect seed starting piece for a potato. When it's like this, you don't have to cut it. You would just plant it as is, and you're good to go. If you have something bigger, maybe something like this would be one that you would probably cut in half, or cut it according to where there's the most eyes. So let's say if there's a lot of eyes on this end right here. If there were a lot of eyes on this end, that'd be a perfect one to cut right here. But maybe let's say there's more eyes on this end right here. So maybe just cut off the top at that point for these eyes and save this piece for the other eyes. The main thing is you're just wanting to try to get 2 or 3 pieces out of a piece this big that has at least 2 eyes per piece. And if you do decide to cut them, so my personal preference is I try to find pieces that are this big. I don't even worry about having to cut them. But if you do have to cut them, the best thing to do is to cut them, and if you have dust and sulfur, go ahead and apply the dust and sulfur right after you cut them. What this is going to do is help kind of heal that cut, going to help it scab over, but it's also going to stop any kind of rot and fungal issues from spreading as well. Now, if you're to cut them, and if you're not going to use that, you're going to want to let these pieces dry out for about 3 to 4 days before you plant them. You just want to make sure that the place that was cut has a very nice kind of hard scab on it. If you are going to use the sulfur and cut them, usually about a day after you apply the sulfur, they're good to go. So if you're short on time and you want to make sure they're not going to rot, go with the sulfur. Okay, so let's talk about soil preparation, how to plant them in containers, and how to plant them in the ground. So if you're doing containers, what I like to do, and I'm going to use this as an example, this is a 15-gallon bucket. This is my preferred size for growing in containers. It does not have to be this big. I've grown them in sizes as small as a 5-gallon bucket. The key is you want something that's probably at least 8 inches to 12 inches tall at the bare minimum. And then the other key is going to be drainage. No matter what you put it in, just make sure it has plenty of holes in the bottom and it has really, really good drainage. So while we're about to plant this, I would start out with Happy Frog, mainly because of the guano it has. That's a proven time-long tested fertilizer for potatoes. I would start by filling this container to about this region right here. Somewhere in this, you can see that somewhere right here. At that point, I would add in my fertilizers to the mix. What I normally like is a combination of blood meal, bone meal, and sometimes this as well. It doesn't have to be that. You can do something as simple as just an all-balanced plant tone. This one's balanced as well, called Rose Glow. I start with those, get that mixed into the soil. At this point, if I have anything like azomite, which is a trace mineral, I'll add that in as well. One of the key things in growing potatoes is they're heavy feeders. So if you don't fertilize, you're not going to get much results. And it really comes down to fertilizing with a lot of these. So after I have that soil all mixed up, I'm about this range right here. I'll add a little bit more soil to kind of give a barrier between the fertilizer and the potato. So I'm about right here in this range is where I'm planting the potato. That is about 3 or 4 inches deep. From that point, I cover the potato, put mulch, leaves, just something to kind of keep that dirt covered, and water it. one other thing I forgot to point out is since drainage is kind of key with these, almost more so than anything else, most of my potatoes that I plant, I add more perlite to the mix. Whether it already has perlite in the potting mix to start with, I usually add more. And I do it at about a 4 parts potting mix to 1 part perlite is what I use. So after that, you water it, mulch it, and then basically you're just kind of waiting for those first few sprouts to go. Before that happens, what you do not want to do is kind of overwater it. You want to start to see some growth and some activity before you start to really regularly water. If you kind of water it as you would in its growing state, before it starts growing, it's just going to rot out. That's what's going to happen. After it starts growing, I fertilize as often as every 2 weeks. And 2 to 4 weeks, somewhere in that range is how I fertilize. And usually at this point, if I already have a lot of green growth, I'm using a liquid fertilizer at this point. And it's either going to be liquid fish or Gary juice, kind of what I like. Sometimes I'll start with a liquid fertilizer, use that, and then in a couple of weeks alternate to a granular, and then go back to fertilizer, things like that. But mainly the key is you got to fertilize if you want any kind of success with potatoes right now. Now, if you're growing in the ground, I haven't had too much success growing in the ground here. It's a little bit more difficult because of the clay. At least I have really bad clay. So if you are going to grow in the ground, it is recommended to use things like expanded shell. This is going to help with your drainage. And things like worm castings, compost, just anything you can use to kind of make your soil more draining. Yes, ma'am.
How much spacing do you put?
Yep, so in a container like this, you want them about 3 to 4 inches deep, anywhere from about 8 to 12 inches apart. On something like this, I would probably, and if I'm using a potato like this size, I'm probably only going to do about 2 of these seed potatoes in here. Probably get away with 3, but 2 or 3. In this one, 1 or 2. It's a little bit smaller of a opening. All right, so when you're planting them in the ground, they're going to be about the same, 8 to 12 inches apart. In the ground, I like to go closer to about 2 to 3 inches because of the clay in my area. After you do that, if you're going to have the rows about 2 feet apart, somewhere in that range. In-ground planting and raised bed planting, you'll probably have to do something, or not in-ground and raised bed, you'll probably have to do something called hilling. And hilling, what some people might think is in order to get more potatoes. It's not really doing that with these varieties. Hilling is to ensure that potatoes, as they grow, they don't become exposed to the sun. So it's just going to help kind of keep those potatoes covered. Because if they're exposed to the sun, that kind of ruins them in terms of them being edible. All right. Any other questions about how to plant them in a container, what to use, anything like that? So in terms of how much sun they need 8 hours or more. So that's full sun. You can grow them in about 6 or less hours, but you're just not going to get as big of a yield as possible. But they will still produce in about 6 hours. The pest that you'll mainly find with a potato is going to be a Colorado potato beetle, small little beetle, striped yellow and blackish, I believe is how it looks. You'll also have leaf hoppers that kind of look like a long leg grasshopper of sorts, which you'll see. Mainly the pests you're going to be dealing with are going to be eating the leaves of the potato. That's mainly what's going to happen. So the potato beetle, the leaf hopper, flea beetle, aphids, that's your main ones. And you can treat all of those with either Captain Jack's powder or this right here. But both are just spinosad or spinosad. And that's just it's an organic bacterium that is used to control those types of bugs. In terms of diseases, you're mainly going to be fighting off disease with fungicides. The main diseases that I see when I'm growing my potatoes are things like powdery mildew and blight. For powdery mildew, what that looks like is a kind of a white, almost powdery substance on the tops and sometimes lower bottom parts of the leaves. To treat that, you would just use a fungicide. This copper fungicide is one that I like to use. Spray the tops and bottom of the leaves, and that should kind of clear that up. The other one you'll mainly run into is a type of blight. If you're familiar with the Irish potato family, and I forget when. 1840
1850s.
Yeah, and that was because of a blight. What caused that? And in terms of fighting blight, it is if you've grown tomatoes, you might be familiar with it. It's hard to fight it once you actually have it. It is more recommended to use a fungicide as a preventative to stop things like potato blight. What that looks like though is it'll start out usually with tiny little brown or black dots on the leaves. Those go to large masses on the leaves, like areas that are dying off towards the tip of the leaf. The brown rot thing can spread to the stem of the plant, and even at time of harvesting, you can see kind of a black or brown part of the potato. That's from the blight as well. What I found with blight is I normally get it towards the end of the growing period. At that point, I don't try to fight it at that point. I'm about to harvest the potatoes already. If it's really, really bad, you don't want the blight to go down to the tubers and ruin the tubers. So if you start to see it and you're at a point where you don't want to let it get out of hand, still you know you probably have good potatoes, go ahead and harvest. If it starts out real early in the life of the plant, good luck trying to get it to stop, even with fungicides and everything. But what I found is if you do have that, hopefully it's towards the end of the life of the plant and you're going to be harvesting anyway, and don't worry about it too much.
Do you need to worry about it? Like, does it stay in the soil?
It does stay in the soil. So if you do have that problem, and in general, it's recommended not to plant potatoes in the same area, kind of rotate your crop that way. But if you are having, if you have problems with tomatoes in that area, I wouldn't plant potatoes there. They're all in that same family. And yeah, if you're having that problem, it's in the soil. All right, so let's go to harvesting and storage. So how do we know when the potatoes are ready? Well, the easiest thing is to remember how long it takes for them to be ready after the days planted, usually 100 days. So remember, write down the date you planted them, and that'll kind of be the easiest way to know when it's actually ready. But if you don't do that, and you just want to go by how the plant looks, the best way to tell is that basically the plant's going to look like it's dead or about to die or sick. So if you've ever grown things like onions, it's the same thing. People that are new to growing these things will think, oh no, my plant's dying, what did I do? You didn't do anything wrong, it's inevitable, it's just the cycle of the plant. And one problem you might run into if you've never grown potatoes is a lot of times these things are starting to get ready as we're really starting to heat up. And what will happen is people will think, oh no, my plant needs more water. It looks like it's dying, it's so hot, I need to give it more water. This is the last thing you want to do. At this point, that potato is done growing. It doesn't really need any more water. And if you're giving it water at that point, you're going to just rot out the potatoes. What will happen is you'll keep giving it water, it doesn't get better, you'll be confused. You go to dump out your bucket or wherever you have them, and you'll find rotted out potatoes. So, keep track of how long it's been planted, and then once you start to see some dieback, cut back on the watering, cut back any of that foliage. That'll help kind of keep any disease getting down to the potato. Some people will say leave them in the bucket or the ground for a few days. This might help harden up the skin. I, for the most part, because I grow most of mine in containers. So when I reach that 100-day mark and the plants are looking like they're ready to harvest, I just pretty much dump them at that point. I don't really let them sit in the soil all that much because I've rotted a bunch of potatoes. I've killed them more so than anything else. So after you've poured them out of the bucket or dug them up, at this point you're going to want to cut off any of the foliage that's attached. You just want to get just the tubers, what you're left with. You do not want to take off the dirt. Leave the dirt on there, don't clean them. Let them sit out in a cool, dry, somewhat dark place with good airflow. That's key, good airflow. Leave them there for a few days, and during this process it's called what's curing, and the skin's kind of hardening up and it's getting ready to be stored for several months. If they're cured properly and stored properly, they can last somewhere up to 6 months, depending on the variety. The Yukon Gold will be the one that lasts the least. It's an early potato. It's meant to be grown quick and then consumed quickly. Whereas all the others take a little bit longer to grow, but they'll last longer in storage as well. You can as simply grow a potato on the ground, cover it with some leaves, cover it with some hay, and they'll grow that way too. If you're interested in growing them that way, there's something called the Roost Stout method. Look into that. It's somewhat helpful in this area for kind of really bad clay areas. What I found with growing that way though is they grow better in containers and soil rather than just throwing them on the ground and covering them with leaves. But They're a pioneer crop for a reason. It's because you can literally just toss them somewhere and you'll get something out of it, most likely. All right, any other questions?
When do we start planting?
Right now.
Right now?
Yeah, so basically any time in the month of February is a good time to plant potatoes.
Even with the weather that's next week?
Yeah, so if it were me, if I have not planted my potatoes yet, you could plant them in this weather. Since we're going to be a few inches down, it's not going to bother them that bad. But if it were me, I would just wait till the weather passes and it's a little better. Just so, because I don't want to be outside. That's the only reason why. That's all. What I've also done is I will start them. This isn't really recommended. This is just kind of experimenting and playing around and stuff like that. But I'll start seed potatoes in about a 1 gallon size container very, very early in the year, sometimes as soon as we get them. I'll grow them out inside like that, and then by the time they're ready, by March or something, I will very gently take them out of that and plant them in the ground or in a pot. And that seems to really give me a big head start in getting potatoes before the heat starts. But I encourage y'all to experiment with how you grow them. There's tons of different ways to do it. There's a new way some people are doing where they'll set the seed potatoes in a shallow tray with dirt. They'll grow out the sprouts. They'll just grow out the shoots basically. We'll harvest the shoots and plant those. And the theory behind this is you're going to get way more potatoes if you do it that way. The downside is that you don't get as many big potatoes. But in parts of the world where supplies are issues and really they have problems just getting that stuff in, that's how they're starting to grow. Is by taking one seed potato, instead of getting one plant, they're starting to get 20 plants, 50 plants out of that seed. And that's pretty much all there is to growing potatoes. All right. Well, I appreciate y'all coming by today.
Thank you.
Thank you.